want to say thank you for everybody coming. We had the privilege this time of having someone who just recently published his book called Khrushchev Lied. I'm going to open up the minutes, open up the meeting, and introduce Professor Grover Furr. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I guess now that I'm wired for sound, I can't be walking in front here, but I do have not only the flyer, the sort of blurb and advertisement for my book, Khrushchev Lied, but on the other side, I have a bibliography of articles, all of which are available on the internet, I believe, which go into other aspects of the falsehoods that are spread about Stalin and the Soviet Union, particularly during the 1930s, and you can download these from the internet for nothing. There aren't many places where you can get them, so maybe if you could pass these around. I can't walk out there and give them to you because I'm going to trip over this wire. You'd pass those around. I only made 30 of them, and I guess a few have been used already, but that's what I have. So feel free, and if you run out, I can just verbally give you the URL to my webpage. I don't want to write on this nice board, but and you can look them up there, and all of these articles are available there or through there. I'll just wait a minute while you pass them around, and then I'll get started. Somebody give me the high sign when okay? All right. Good afternoon. I'd like to thank George Grunthal and his colleagues for inviting me to speak to you today here. I would also like to dedicate this talk to two special people in my life. First, my son, Joseph Furr, a diesel mechanic who died tragically in January 2009. And secondly, my dad, also named Grover Furr, who died this past Wednesday, and to whose memorial service I'm going to go to tonight, and it will take place tomorrow. So thank you. Thank you very much. The occasion for my talk, I hope you don't mind if I read it. It's going to come better if I read it. Occasion for my talk is the publication of the English version of my book, Khrushchev Lied, the subtitle of which is the evidence that every, quote, revelation of Stalin's and Beria's, quote, crimes in Nikita Khrushchev's infamous secret speech to the 20th Party Congress of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union on February 25th, 1956, is provably false. And the proof is in the book. This is a revised and updated version of the Russian edition of the book, published in December 2007 by Algorithm Publishers, Moscow, under the title Anti-Stalinskaya Podlost, or Anti-Stalinist Villainy. George Kapadze back there has a copy of it. Thank you. And republished in October 2010 under the title Tayny 20th Съезда, or Secrets of the 20th Congress. There are 16,500 copies of this Russian edition in print. Most of them have been sold. In Russia, as in the West, Khrushchev is an official hero. Students in Russia study Khrushchev's secret speech because it is a turning point in Soviet and therefore Russian history. If I speak too quickly or not loud enough, be sure to let me know, okay? I'm not sure about the acoustics in this room. It was also a turning point in world history. But outside Russia, very few people now read this long speech, full of references to people and events they have never heard of. For that reason, I'm also going to briefly mention some other issues in Soviet history that are far better known than the ones Khrushchev mentioned in his speech. Evidence and research are basically what I have to offer here. And there are very few people doing the work that I do. Almost everyone else who is researching the Stalin period in the Soviet Union, and who can read Russian fluently, and who has the research skills, and who has the institutional affiliation that can provide them with library facilities and the vital and very expensive interlibrary loan facilities, and who has the interest and motivation to do this work, almost everyone else is an anti-communist, lacking all objectivity. I'll say something about objectivity later on. The few who do have access to these facilities and are not anti-communists are, for the most part, in the field of Soviet or Russian history themselves. And in that field, it is a basic requirement that you be an anti-communist. In the very few instances where this is not so, you simply have to steer clear of writing anything that will upset, much less contradict, the anti-communists. I have been told by two fine researchers in Soviet history, researchers who are not leftist, but who strive to be objective, that no book that is not hostile to Stalin can be published by an academic publisher. That is certainly true in the West, and I believe it, in my experience, to be true in Russia as well. Let me put this another way to you. If you were in the field of Soviet history, if you taught Soviet history in a history department, you could not do the research I do. If you did, you could not be published in the standard journals or by mainstream academic publishers, and you would soon not be in the field of Soviet history anymore because you wouldn't have a job. This is why my position is unusual. I teach in an English department. My academic livelihood does not depend in any way on my research into Soviet history. This is what I have to offer. And a lot of people around the world think this is important. Not just people on the left, such as those of you here. The anti-communists also think it's important, and they don't like it. This research is the reason that I was attacked by David Horowitz in 2005, and again in his book in 2006.
Good job.
Thank you. It's the reason that the chief conservative columnist for the largest newspaper in the state of New Jersey, the Star-Ledger, devoted 2 of his columns in 2005 to attacking me. The reason that my university has received dozens of emails from anti-communists of one stripe or another demanding that I be fired. A lot of people on the right do not want the truth about the history of the communist movement in the Soviet Union during the Stalin years to come to light. They want to continue to demonize it, to compare it to Hitler and fascism, and to lie about it. And that's what they do, not only passively through their point of view or bias, but actively by deliberately falsifying the evidence, sources, and history. So what I have to offer is a corrective to all of this, and that's what I want to talk to you about today. Back in January, I asked George what kinds of historical questions I should speak about today. George replied, I'm quoting you here, George, wherever you are. There you go. Basically, we think it would be good if you could talk about a few major examples of Khrushchev's lies, maybe allegations that Stalin had Kirov murdered. And you also wrote, I think that questions of research, evidence, etc., while important, are somewhat secondary to the facts, particularly for our group, since we are basically a political and not an academic organization. Understandable, but I must disagree in part with my friend George here. Facts cannot be separated from research and evidence. It is by research and evidence that we establish what is factual and what isn't. There is no other way. It was by forbidding research and withholding evidence that Khrushchev was able to get away with his lies for over 50 years. And Khrushchev enabled all the Cold War anti-communists, whether inside the Soviet Union, like Roy Medvedev, who wrote that book, Let History Judge, and others, or in the West, like Robert Conquest and many others. Khrushchev-era falsifications continue to enable the, quote, mainstream voices in Soviet history today. I ought to tell you a little about myself and where I'm coming from. My first field of specialization is medieval studies. I was trained to do deeply historical research. For instance, to use primary sources in languages other than in English, never to rely on received knowledge or received opinion, not to trust the opinion of, quote, recognized authorities, to check every reference, every footnote for myself. I'd like also to say a word about objectivity. Objectivity as a scientific method is a practice of distrust of the self. One can learn to be objective by training oneself to become aware of, to articulate, and then to doubt one's own views. One must be automatically suspicious of evidence that tends to confirm one's own preconceived ideas, prejudices, and preferences. One must learn to give an especially generous reading, to search especially hard for, to lean over backwards to consider evidence and arguments that contradict one's own biases. This is elementary stuff. Every historian knows it or ought to know it. Objectivity is a practice, like learning a foreign language. You can become good at it through practice by deliberate effort. Moreover, you must do this if you want to learn the truth. And Marxists want to know the truth. Marx and Engels wrote that, quote, "The proletariat has nothing to lose but its chains." By that, I assume they meant that we have no sacred cows, nothing we refuse to subject to critical scrutiny. We want to cast aside all illusions and falsehoods. Only the truth shall make us free, if we are against all exploitation of man by man, if we are the international working class. Marx's favorite slogan was "De omnibus dubitandum," question everything, and your preconceived ideas and biases above all others. If you want to learn the truth, that's what you must do. Moreover, it is what every bourgeois detective in every detective story knows. As Sherlock Holmes used to say, keep your mind free of precipitate conclusions. Get the facts before you form your hypotheses. Be ready to abandon a hypothesis that does not explain the established facts. If you don't do this, if you don't try to discover the truth from the outset, then you are not going to stumble upon the truth by accident along the way. And what you do find will not be the truth. This is what I try hard to do. None of the demonizers of Stalin and the Soviet Union, the anti-communist so-called experts on the history of the communist movement, make any attempt to be objective. They do not discover the truth then because they don't want to do so. They want to write what might be called propaganda with footnotes. And that's what their works are. A little bit more about my background. As a graduate student from 1965 to 1969, I opposed the US war in Vietnam. At some point, somebody told me that the Vietnamese communists could not be the good guys because they were led by Ho Chi Minh, who had been trained by Stalin. And, quote, Stalin had killed millions of innocent people. Right? We all hear that all the time. I remembered this remark. It was probably the reason in the early 1970s that I read the first edition of Robert Conquest's book, The Great Terror, when it was published. Believe me, I was shaken by what I read. I should add that I could read the Russian language, since I had already been studying Russian literature since high school. So I studied Conquest's book very carefully. Using the resources of the Slavic Room at the New York Public Library, and occasionally interlibrary loan, I checked every one of his more than 1,000 footnotes. Apparently, no one else had ever done this. I discovered that Conquest had no source criticism at all. His footnotes did not support his anti-Stalin and anti-Soviet conclusions. Conquest used any source that was hostile to Stalin, regardless of whether it was reliable or not. As long as it was in print, he used it. Eventually, I decided to write something about the so-called terror. It took a long time, but in 1988, I finally published an article on the Tukhachevsky affair. It's on my webpage. During this time, I also studied the research being done by the new school of historians on the Soviet Union that included such people as Arch Getty, Robert Thurston, Sheila Fitzpatrick, and others. The school of which I speak now arose as the antithesis to Conquest and to the totalitarian concept of Sovietology of the Cold War period. By carefully studying the evidence already available, and, more important, by trying hard to be objective, the researchers of this new school were already showing that all the Cold War, Trotskyist, Khrushchevite, and later the Gorbachev-Yeltsin history was fatally compromised by political bias. These had managed to so compromise their work by their political prejudices that their books should be viewed not as history, but as examples of propaganda. In the world of scientific history, the book The Origins of the Great Purges by Arch Getty, one of the founders of this new school, became a genuine sensation. In it, Getty successfully disproved a large number of falsehoods that had been accepted as true. This included, among other things, the notion that the repressions of the 1930s had been actions planned in advance by Stalin. It was Getty's misfortune that his work was published in the United States during the years of the so-called perestroika. During this time, under the false cover of glasnost, or openness, only the works of Cold Warriors were published, and those were published in huge editions. How could Russian readers find out about the pioneering works of Getty or Robert Thurston if none of their books on Russian history has ever been published in Russia itself? The same situation holds in the case of most of the historians whose names I mentioned above. But fortunately, there are also a few more encouraging examples. 2 years ago, a Ukrainian internet magazine published one of the excellent works by Professor Mark Tauger of the University of West Virginia. Tauger's work utterly disproves the Nazi-inspired myth that the famine of 1932-33 was a, quote, holodomor, or man-made famine carried out deliberately by Soviet leaders. Now about Khrushchev's speech. The closed, or as it is called in English, the secret report of Khrushchev's is without exaggeration one of the most influential speeches of the 20th century. It fundamentally changed the path of Soviet and indeed of world history. It is significant that precisely this speech has become one of the pillars of the political conception of, quote, anti-Stalinism, the foundational source for what can be called the paradigm of the 20th Congress. In short, no one interested in the history of the Soviet Union can ignore a document of such importance. When I was forming a conception of this work meaning my book, my goal was modest. I wanted to place the so-called revelations in the report alongside the historical sources that have been made public thanks to the declassification of some documents from the former Soviet archives. This kind of work could in principle be done by a Russian historian, or for that matter, by a Chinese historian. For during the past 20 years, a large number of new sources have been made available to scholars that make possible an objective evaluation of the statements in Khrushchev's speech. And at this point, a curious picture began to emerge. For as it turned out of all of the so-called revelations affirmed in that report by Khrushchev that I could verify, not one of them turned out to be true. Not a single one. A few of Khrushchev's falsehoods were, of course, known earlier, such as his absurd declaration that Stalin, quote, planned military operations on a globe. But that the entire speech was made up of revelations like this one, that was astonishing. Of course, you can read about that in the book. A word about Stalin. I am not defending Stalin or anyone else. As a researcher and a scholar, I deal with facts and evidence. I agree with Russian historian Yuri Zhukov when he writes, I can honestly tell you that I oppose the rehabilitation of Stalin because I oppose rehabilitations in general. Nothing and no one in history should be rehabilitated, but we must uncover the truth and speak the truth. Nor do I wish to suggest that, if only Stalin had had his way, or had lived longer, the manifold problems of building socialism or communism in the Soviet Union would have been solved. So I chose to research the report that supposedly, quote, uncovered crimes of Stalin and Beria. I isolated 61 revelations or accusatory assertions. I researched each one of them in the light of the historical sources. The end result was that in Khrushchev's secret speech, not a single one of such revelations turned out to be true. There is no question here of defending Stalin. Not one of the revelatory assertions of the secret speech can withstand a confrontation with the evidence. Like it or not, in view of the historical evidence presented in anti-Stalinist villainy, or as the English version is Khrushchev Lied, it is impossible to view the history of the Soviet Union in the distorted funhouse mirror of the secret speech any longer. Something about the implications of this discovery. Russian historian Yuri Zhukov, I quote him once again, described the archival situation in Russia in the following way. Quote, with the beginning of perestroika, one of the slogans of which was glasnost, which means openness, the Kremlin archive, formerly closed to researchers, was liquidated. Its holdings began to be relocated in various public archives. This process began, but was not completed. Without any publicity or explanation of any kind, in 1996, the most important, pivotal materials were again reclassified. Hidden away in the archive of the President of the Russian Federation, the Special Secret Archive. Soon the reasons for this secretive operation became clear. It permitted the resurrection of one of the two old and very shabby myths. By these two old and shabby myths, Zhukov means the myth of Stalin the villain and Stalin the universal genius. You know, only the first of these myths is familiar to readers of Western and anti-communist historiography, and that is the myth that, according to Zhukov, the reclassification of the archives was meant to permit, right? The myth of Stalin, the villain, was in danger of being exploded by the discoveries in the archives, and this is why the archives, many of the crucial archives, were reclassified. Arch Getty has called the historical research done during the period of the Cold War, quote, products of propaganda, research which it makes no sense to criticize or to try to correct in its individual parts, but which must be done all over again from the beginning. I agree. And I would add that this tendentious, politically charged, and dishonest research is still being produced today. The rediscovery of Soviet history goes far beyond the critique of Khrushchev's secret speech. Everything that passes not just for common knowledge, but for expert knowledge about the Stalin period is fundamentally false. To paraphrase one of my favorite singers, Weird Al Yankovic, quote, everything you know is wrong. Meaning, everything you know about the Stalin period in the Soviet Union is wrong. All of Soviet history needs to be rewritten. Here are a few examples. Collectivization. In fact, collectivization solved the eternal problem of recurrent crop failures and famines. Up until 1932-33, there had been a famine every 2 or 3 years in Russia and in the Ukraine. Thanks to collectivization, the famine of 1932-33 was the last one, except for the famine of 1946-47, caused by the huge destruction of the war, plus bad weather. This is the field in which Mark Tauger of West Virginia University has been working in all his life, and he has come up with very, very strong evidence. This is a gentleman, and I call him a gentleman because he really is a wonderful guy who is not in the least a leftist, simply a historian, and is attacked all the time by anti-communists and anti-Semites as a dirty Jewish communist because he refuses to kowtow to the capitalist party line, right? That the famine was deliberately caused and was some sort of terrible atrocity, but insists on laying out the truth. So I've been closely in touch with him to encourage him in this research, and he's finally getting a little bit of recognition, even though he's still getting a lot of attacks. Collectivization also saved Europe from Nazism. Without it, rapid industrialization and a modern Red Army would not have been possible. The Nazis would have conquered the Soviet Union and had its immense natural and human resources to turn against the Allies. I've spent a great deal of time and effort in studying the question of opposition conspiracies during the 1930s. My Moscow-based colleague Vladimir Bobrov and I have published a number of articles on them. Much more is yet to come. The opposition conspiracies alleged in the Moscow trials did exist. The Moscow trial defendants were guilty of at least what they confessed to. In a few cases, like that of Bukharin, we know they were guilty of more than what they confessed to. There are some articles on the back of this handout that's going around. Some of our articles are listed that we published on this subject. Leon Trotsky did indeed collaborate with the Germans and Japanese. Likewise, the Trotsky archives, something that virtually nobody reads, show that Trotsky lied over and over again to the Dewey Commission hearings. The various Trotsky archives around the world hold documents that show that Trotsky and his son, Leon Sedov, discussed what lies they were going to tell to the Dewey Commission between each other and in their writings. Yeah. The so-called Great Terror of 1937-38 was deliberately caused by Nikolai Yezhov, head of the NKVD, who killed probably several 100,000 Soviet citizens in an attempt to sow discontent with the Soviet government and help open the door for a German and/or Japanese invasion. The military conspiracies, colloquially known as the Tukhachevsky affairs, were genuine. They did happen. The Soviet Union did not invade Poland in 1939. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact did not divide up Poland, much less Europe. It enabled the Allied victory in World War II. The Nazi propaganda version that the Soviets shot 14,000 or 22,000 or however many Polish prisoners of war at Katyn has been seriously challenged. There is good evidence that the so-called smoking gun documents published by Yeltsin in 1992 and given to the Poles and spread all over the world are forgeries. This came out about a year ago. The only source, by the way, concerning the Katyn massacre issue, the only source in English for information about this fascinating historical question, one in which the evidence is still being uncovered, is my webpage on the subject, which is linked on my homepage, which you all have. I also have articles, some shorter, others longer, and with fuller documentations about all of the issues I mentioned above. Since George mentioned explicitly the allegation that Khrushchev had Sergei Kirov murdered on December 1st, 1934, you mentioned it, I'm going to say a few words about that. It's a subject that I'm working on right now. Khrushchev wished to prove that Stalin had Kirov killed. This was part of his plan to declare all the defendants at the Moscow trials innocent. He only just begins to do this in the secret speech of 1956. He doesn't really come out and say it in that secret speech. I deal with it, therefore, very briefly in this book. But he continued and did much more of this later on. Eventually, Khrushchev's top-level commission found that Stalin did not kill Kirov. They found this because there was just no evidence of it at all. But they could not, or they did not want to, contradict Khrushchev's basic historical paradigm. So they concluded that Leonid Nikolaev, who shot Kirov and was caught on the spot, was a, quote, lone gunman. Stalin, therefore, must have had everybody else framed. They declared all the Moscow trials to be frame-ups and all the defendants innocent. This became the basic story for the Western anti-communists, too, as well as for Roy Medvedev and the Soviet Khrushchevite anti-communists. Robert Conquest picked it up. Conquest and others eventually returned to the story that Stalin killed Kirov. First Conquest, then Amy Knight, another Western anti-communist researcher, wrote books attempting to prove this. Gorbachev's men wanted to prove it too. Alexander Yakovlev, Gorbachev's right-hand man, tried hard to encourage Gorbachev's rehabilitation commissions and Politburo researchers to prove that Stalin killed Kirov, but they were unable to do so. Eventually, they too fell back on the Khrushchev-era findings that Nikolaev was a lone gunman, and Stalin had framed everybody like the evil guy they wanted him to be. This is the position assumed, not proven or even argued, but assumed by Alla Kirillina, the Russian authority on Kirov. She was the curator of the Kirov Museum in Leningrad for many years and published her book in the 1990s and again in 2001. Last September 2010, Matthew Leno, a professor of Russian history at the University of Rochester, published an 800-page book in the Yale University Press's Annals of Communism series titled The Kirov Murder in Soviet History. Leno has spent the last decade writing this book. It is meant to be the last word on the subject. In it, Leno claims that he has proven the Khrushchev-Gorbachev-Kirillina hypothesis that Nikolaev was a lone gunman and that Stalin framed everybody. I am in the middle, really in the last third, of a book-length project that begins with a detailed dissection of Leno's book. and goes on to consider all the evidence that Lino never considers, either dismisses or ignores entirely, never even telling his readers that it exists. There is no doubt that Lino is wrong. We have a huge amount of evidence now. It proves that the men convicted and executed along with Nikolaev at the end of December 1934 were in fact guilty. More than that, we have a huge amount of evidence that the accused in the Moscow trials, all three of them, were also guilty. Guilty not just of what they confessed to, but also of crimes which they did not confess, but which came to light later on. The same is true of the military men convicted in the so-called Tukhachevsky affair. We now possess a huge amount of evidence of their guilt. This innocence is asserted by every authority in the field, but the evidence tells the story. My colleague Vladimir and I have done much research on this as well. By evidence, remember, I'm talking about documents from the former Soviet archives that have been released for one reason or another, here and there, often in obscure places, since 1991. And a big part of my work is simply finding it, right? Learning of it, finding it, tracking it down, locating it, getting copies of it. Then, of course, you have to study it. It's not all collected any place. Lino does not even mention most of this evidence, undoubtedly because it contradicts his own preconceived idea that Nikolaev was a lone gunman. The point is, that has to be his conclusion, because it is the only conclusion acceptable to mainstream anti-communist historiography. Just like, quote, the Soviets shot all the Polish POWs in cold blood is the only version of the Katyn massacre acceptable to mainstream anti-communist historiography. Because Lino and Karelina hide from their readers the evidence that contradicts their conclusions, you can only learn of this evidence at all if you spend a lot of time, effort, and money identifying, locating, obtaining, and studying it. And that's what I do. I cite these examples to illustrate, just as some examples, how completely fraudulent the, quote, canonical history of the Soviet Union has been and remains. And this history is canonical, not just for pro-capitalist anti-communists, but unfortunately for almost all of the left as well. By left, I mean perhaps the so-called left, but let's not get into that. People who consider themselves on the left widely believe all of this stuff. The political forces that promoted first a greater role for the market in Soviet society, and then the wholesale return to super-exploitative capitalism in the Soviet Union, are the same ones who demonize Stalin in the Stalin years. They also sponsor the research or propaganda that spreads this version of history, which is the mainstream version in Russia as it is elsewhere. The historiography of the Soviet Union has been dominated by propaganda from the beginning, from 1917. Some of you may know or have heard of, or perhaps even read, the study written by the young Walter Lippmann and Charles Mertz and published in the New Republic magazine on August the 4th, 1920, in which they called The Test of the News. If you haven't, I can get you a copy, but the only place I think in the world you can get a copy is from me, because nobody else has reprinted this document. Mertz and Lippmann studied the reporting on the Russian Revolution, starting in 1917 and going through 1920, in the New York Times, which was the paper of record at that time as it is today. And they concluded that the Times was completely wrong on everything. That the Times reported what the reporters and editors wanted to believe and not what was really going on. They drew some foolish conclusions that somehow or other this could be stopped by having better journalism schools. They really had no solution for this problem. I, and I'm sure you, would draw very different conclusions. But my point is that the lying about the Russian Revolution started the day the Russian Revolution took place and has been going on ever since and hasn't stopped. The propaganda came to predominate over the scholarship, particularly during the post-World War II Cold War period. During the past decade, I have spent a great deal of time and also money acquiring and studying the documents from former Soviet archives that have been released since the end of the Soviet Union in 1991. I have confined my own study to those documents that deal with the Stalin period, and within that period I have mainly concentrated on the 1930s, though Khrushchev deals with the 20s, 40s, and early 50s in his speech, and so to that extent at least, to the extent of investigating the claims that he made in his speech, I have investigated those topics as well. But mainly I've concentrated on the 30s. I've also studied a great many secondary sources by well-known experts on this period in Russia and in the West. All of the most famous voices and controlling influences in Soviet history are anti-communist ideologues who misuse historical science in the interest of demonizing Stalin, the Stalin period, socialism, and the Soviet Union itself. This is not only a matter of political bias, though there is plenty of that. There is a great deal of deliberate falsification, provable outright lying, not only by Khrushchev, but in the works of contemporary famous historians of the Soviet Union. I demonstrate in my book that Khrushchev used a number of different methods of prevarication, misdirection, and falsehood, but the most common one of all, 40 out of the 61 so-called revelations, are provably just lies. Khrushchev knew he was not telling the truth. Chapter 10 in my book is an analysis of the different ways in which Khrushchev used different techniques of falsehood. The same thing is true about the works of many of the most famous academic historians of the Soviet Union today, both Western and Russian. Because this talk is being taped, and I understand may be put on the internet, I won't mention any names, because I don't want to be, I don't want to go there, I don't want to be sued, but it's certainly the case. Okay, a few concluding remarks here. At some point in every class I teach, and remember I don't teach Soviet history, I ask my students, what is the most radical word in any language? I get a number of answers commonly. Among the most frequent are socialism, communism. Then I say, socialism and communism are good radical words, all right, but my vote is for a different word, evidence. Ask for evidence everywhere and always, and you will be called a communist soon enough. This is nowhere more valid than in the study of the history of the communist movement. Lies predominate, and when you probe for the evidence, things start to get interesting. I'm often told, of course, I'm called lots of names just because I require evidence. I'm often told, Grover, I don't find your arguments persuasive. A friend of mine told me that the other day. My response goes like this. Persuasion is a form of propaganda. Persuasion depends on the mindset of the person you are trying to persuade. Upton Sinclair once wrote, quote, it is difficult to get a man to understand something when his salary depends upon his not understanding it. A person with very fixed preconceived ideas cannot be persuaded by any evidence, no matter how good it is. Likewise, it is difficult, if not impossible, to get a person to look at the evidence in an objective manner when doing so will force him to confront the possibility that his most cherished prejudices and preconceived ideas are wrong. His peace of mind, the fellowship of his friends, maybe even his job, depends upon his worshiping the, quote, common knowledge, the, quote, idols of the tribe. But I can tell you this, I make many of my discoveries by following up the footnotes in the works of academic secondary sources, checking to see whether the primary sources cited in those notes really provide evidence for the fact claims or statements that are made. It is very often the case that they don't. The evidence does not prove the fact claim made. The Cold War Khrushchevite paradigm has been the prevailing view of the history of the Stalin years. The research reported on here can contribute towards a clearing of the ground, a beginning all over again from the beginning, The truth that finally emerges will also have great meaning for the great Marxist project of understanding the world in order to change it, of building a classless society of social and economic justice. Thank you.